The morning Calder's reach died, I was sealed in the negative pressure ward doing rounds, and that single accident of routine is the only reason I lived to tell anyone what happened. I had been the colony's senior medic for 9 years by then, long enough to know most of our 11,000 by face if not by name, which shift they worked, which child belonged to which family, who'd come through my surgery and who hadn't needed to. We were a farming colony built to feed 3 systems, terrace farms climbing the valley walls, grain elevators taller than the old chapel, harvesters working the lower fields since before dawn. 18 months earlier, our survey teams had pushed the south terraces into a stretch of scrubland the charts called unclaimed. The Tholbane called it something else. We never found out what, not in words. We found out in the only language they apparently thought we deserved. It came in on the wind. No ships, no warning klaxon, nothing the orbital net flagged as a threat. Just a fine gray haze drifting down out of a clear sky. A little after 7, I watched it settle on the observation glass of the ward like pollen. Then Foreman Ito walked off the number 4 catwalk into the grain auger without slowing his stride, the way a man steps over a threshold he's crossed 10,000 times. Through the glass I saw 3 trainees from the agricultural co-op walk into the intake of a running harvester in a neat, unhurried line, the way you'd file into a transport. A woman I knew from the chapel choir opened an airlock without a suit on and stepped through it like she was stepping onto a porch. My own ward orderly, who had been standing at the containment door not asking to be let out, simply turned and walked into the corridor beyond it, once the lock cycled on its own, for no reason I ever found. None of them ran. None of them screamed first. That was the worst of it, not the deaths, but the absence of anything resembling fear in the moment before. Whatever the bloom did, it didn't make people want to die. It simply removed, for the better part of an hour, the part of a person that flinches. I beat on that glass until my hands split open, and I have never once been ashamed of how useless that was. Colonial Command tried to raise an evacuation order over the General Channel 3 separate times. I still have the recording. By the second attempt, half the voices reading it back weren't reading anymore. By the time the haze thinned, 6 hours after it settled, 9,640 of us were gone. The Tholbane left a marker in high orbit, broadcasting on an open frequency, repeating a single designation over and over in their own tongue, translated for us only much later. Correction, Calder's reach, instance 1. As if we were a sum that needed adjusting. As if 18 months of scrub grass outweighed 11,000 lives. I didn't have words for what I felt that week. I had a notebook, a sample kit, and a job. I logged every name I could confirm against the colony register, cross-checked against shift rosters, against dental records when nothing else was left. I sealed filtration samples from 6 different intake systems before Colonial Command thought to ask whether anyone had. Nobody told me to do it. I didn't have anything else my hands knew how to do, and a man needs something to do with his hands on a day like that, or he stops being able to use them at all. It took the labs back home 6 years to turn what I'd sealed into something we could use, and every one of those years was a deliberate choice, not a delay we suffered. There were people in command who wanted to send a fleet within the first season, before the grief had even finished arriving home in every direction. They were talked out of it, and rightly. A weapon you don't understand is just a second atrocity waiting to happen on a schedule you don't control. I asked for a transfer to the program myself, the month the call went out for anyone with field exposure data. I was the only surviving medical witness with a complete chain of custody on the samples, and I told the review board that plainly, without dressing it up, and they took me. I spent most of those 6 years inside a research bay with floor-to-ceiling skylights, because somebody decided grief workers shouldn't be kept in the dark, and I watched better chemists than I'll ever be fail 1,100 times before strain 1101 held its structure for longer than 4 seconds in a contained trial. I remember the morning it held for an hour. Nobody cheered. The lead chemist just sat down on the floor of the bay and put her head in her hands, and I understood exactly what she was feeling, because I had been carrying the same 6-year weight in a different shape. What we built wasn't a weapon assembled in a single triumphant afternoon. It was 6 years of failure logged in the same flat, patient hand the Tholbane used to log us, because by then I understood that patience was the only language they respected, and we intended to speak it back to them at a scale they couldn't file away as an externality. Around us, In 9 separate dry docks across the system, the reaping fleet went up hull by hull. 1,260 warships, built without ceremony, crewed by people who'd lost a neighbor, a congregation, a shift partner at Calder's Reach, and 100 sites like it since. Nobody made speeches over the keel layings. We were not an army assembled out of rage. We were an army assembled out of arithmetic, and the arithmetic had been sitting unanswered for 6 years. The registry I'd kept went into the fleet's targeting data, alongside the orbital markers coordinates, decoded at last. 9,640 names, attached to a destination the Tholbane called Veshtara, the cradle world, the seat of whatever ancient patience had decided our valley needed correcting in the first place. We arrived in full daylight, because the Tholbane don't observe night the way we do, and because I think every captain in that fleet wanted them to see it coming, and understand, in the last clear moment they had left to understand anything, exactly what it was, and exactly where it had come from. Veshtara was beautiful in the way old, careful things are beautiful. Terraced groves 1,000 years tended, structures grown rather than built, the whole world arranged like a garden that had never once been rushed in all its long history. I watched it from the deck of a hospital ship riding in the fleet's second column, because that was where 6 years of training had finally put me, and because somebody on that crossing still needed a medic who knew exactly what was coming, and exactly how little he'd be able to do about it. The reaping fleet didn't fire a shot. It didn't need to. 1,260 hulls broke atmosphere over the cradle world's primary holdings and released, in a fine gray haze that drifted down out of a clear sky, the same correction the Tholbane had logged 6 years earlier as Instance 1. I won't describe in any detail what an ancient, patient people look like when the patience finally runs out from under them. I will say it took 6 hours, the same 6 hours it took us at Calder's Reach, and that nobody on either side of that exchange ran or screamed first, because the compound doesn't permit it. Late in those 6 hours, a handful of Tholbane reached our perimeter anyway, on foot, the way the bloom leaves a small margin at its edges, where the dose runs thin. I treated them. I set a fracture on one, and cleaned a wound on another, and did it the same way I'd have done it for anyone, because that has always been my job, and I have never once stopped doing it. Not for them, and not for anyone else. None of them understood what was being done to their world, any more than Foreman Ito had understood it walking into the auger. I didn't explain it to them. There wasn't a version of the explanation that would have meant anything in the time they had left to hear it. When it was finished, I closed the registry. 9,640 names, each one checked twice, each one finally and formally answered. I didn't broadcast them on the Tholbane's own sacred frequencies, the way some captains wanted to. I didn't need to. Calder's Reach had taught me that some debts don't require an audience to be paid in full, only a ledger, kept honestly across 6 patient years, and a hand steady enough, at the end of it, to close the book.